Start 'em, sit 'em.
Oh, so excited. This is kind of my thing. Should we start off with the quarterbacks?
Let's do it.
All
Who are
right.
we starting?
And we're going to start off with Jared Goff.
That we
And
otherwise would not be starting. Why we should clarify, right? Like
this is
start
a
them, sit them. Like there's some guys that are obvious. You're obviously starting them.
correct.
Like
And
we are not going to tell you to start Jalen Hurts. No, duh. Who should
right.
we start that you might not otherwise think that's a guy I need to get in?
Goff against the Rams, revenge game. He's very good at home. In fact, he's averaging 19.4 points per game in 25 regular season starts as a Lion at Ford Field. The Rams gave up the ninth most points to home quarterbacks last season. So Jared Goff in a revenge game. And by the way, Matt Stafford, maybe not a bad play either in what could be a high scoring affair. Also a very good play. And then let's go with Tua Tagovailoa. Now, I know he wasn't very reliable last year. I get it, but he averaged 17 points per game at home. He was better at home than he was on the road. He opens in South Florida at Hard Rock against the Jaguars. Last year, Linz, no road defense gave up more fantasy points to quarterbacks at 22.3 points per game. And oh, by the way, Vegas has the total at 49.5. So this should be a high scoring game.
High scoring game. Did you know that Jared Goff is playing 14 of 17 games in the dome? Ooh, I'm just kidding. You, of course, heard that. That's like the stat of the season that everyone's going to say way too
We do
much.
know
Who are we
that.
sitting? Who are we sitting?
Let's start off with Justin Herbert. I want to see what this offense looks like, to be quite honest with you. He goes from an offense that's going to throw the ball a lot to one under Greg Roman that is very run based. And so that's a problem. He's playing the Raiders. They actually allowed an average of 14.6 points per game to quarterbacks last year. So that was kind of tough. The over-under is 41.5. So Vegas is not expecting a ton of points. So I'm going to fade Herbert and I'm going to fade Captain Kirk Cousins against the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's playing his first game since tearing his Achilles midway through last year. And so, that could be a factoid. He's also playing with a new team and a new offense with new teammates. That could be an issue in terms of getting cohesive. And then you look at the Steelers. Their defense allowed an average of fewer than 15 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks last year. So Kirk Cousins is not in a great position to succeed.
Chances are good too. Kirk Cousins is not your QB1. So
No,
you
he's probably
probably
not. Yeah.
positioned yourself in such a way that you can afford to just like
Right.
hit pause, wait and see how it looks, and then plug
Yep.
him in down the
Mhm.
road. Running backs. Who are we starting?
James Cook, who I've got in my top 10 this week, he was really good last year in the second half once Joe Brady took over the offense. He was averaging nearly 20 touches a game. Brady likes to run the ball and use his running backs. And this is a really good matchup against Arizona. They allowed 15 plus fantasy points to running backs 10 times, including 5 who scored over 27 points. So this is a smash spot. So get in the kitchen and cook with the Bills running back. That was midseason form right there. All right, next up.
Okay.
Javonte Williams, maybe not, who was not drafted to be a starter in a lot of leagues. People were worried because he didn't perform last year, but he's now a full year removed from the knee injury. Samaje Perine got cut. He's in Kansas City now. The matchup's really good against the Seattle Seahawks. Their defense allowed the third most fantasy points to running backs last year. They were worse at home, too. Running backs averaged almost 28 points per game against them at Lumen Field. So Javonte Williams is a very nice low RB2 flex this week.
Not worried about Jaleel McLaughlin. Anybody else there? It's Javonte. You're good.
I am fine with it. Yes.
Okay.
You are not going to agree with this first sit-em. And I will tell you, this is not a hard sit. This is a beware or don't play him in DFS, whatever the case may be, but Kyren Williams. And the reason why is the Lions were nasty good against running backs last year. They were unbelievably good. In fact, they gave up the fewest fantasy points to running backs, and only two scored more than 11 points against them at home. So I understand you've got to play Kyren Williams, but temper your expectations for the Rams, punt returner? Just temper your expectations. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that you have to sit him. I'm just saying temper expectations. I'm also worried about Zach Moss this week. And I know I talked about Zach Moss as being a guy that I would rather have over Chase Brown because Brown's ADP went up and Zach Moss's was not as high. So I'll take the discount. But even the matchup's not great here. The Patriots, their defense might not be great against the pass, but against the run, they allowed the third fewest fantasy points to home running backs last year. And when you consider that this could be a 50-50 split to begin the year, I'm thinking that Zach Moss is a bit of a risk.
Read a lot yesterday about the Bengals running backs and that offense and whether they'd be out of the gun or incorporate more under center. And people really talking up the fact that Zach Moss might be a better fit for that offense, and Joe Burrow, who likes to be in the gun and see the field in that sense. So I'm really curious to see what that looks like. Starts at wide receiver.
Beam me up, Scotty. Let's go with Christian Kirk. Do you get the reference there? And I don't even like Star Trek. I'm more of a Star Wars guy. Yeah. Now Kirk's been dealing with an injured calf.
References.
It looks like he's good to go against Miami. This is a really good matchup. Again, I mentioned it. The over-under is almost 50 in this game. Miami allowed a total of 13 opposing wide receivers last year to score over 15 points against them. Christian Kirk, I do believe, is the number one option in the offense for Trevor Lawrence. So start Christian Kirk as a flex. And then Chris Godwin. I like the matchup too. Now, Godwin was really tough to trust last year at times. And obviously Mike Evans is the alpha here, and he's a must start in this game against the Commanders, but they were bad against receivers last year. They allowed 29 touchdowns and the second most points to the position. And Washington was really bad on the road against wide receivers too, allowing the third most receiving yards among visiting defenses. So Chris Godwin is a strong flex starter this week.
I went and looked up target numbers for each team yesterday, and I was shocked a little bit just based on the way last season went that he was so close to Mike Evans in terms of targets last year. Mike Evans had 132. Chris Godwin had 129. So I think he's a guy who's maybe flying a little bit under our radar relative to his ADP heading into this season. Who are we sitting at wide receiver?
Much like with Kareem Williams, this is more of a beware, and that's Brandon Aiyuk. Now, Brandon Aiyuk was holding out. He didn't play in the preseason. He didn't participate in training camp. Maybe that matters. Maybe it doesn't. But I'm more worried about the matchup, too. The Jets are good against the pass. Last year, Sauce Gardner and crew, I mean, they allowed the fewest fantasy points to perimeter receivers. And Brandon Aiyuk runs most of his routes out wide. So if you play him, you got to temper expectations for Brandon Aiyuk. And another guy, George Pickens. Maybe you drafted him as your wide receiver too. Maybe he's going to be your flex, and maybe you got to play him. Totally understand that. Just keep in mind, he's not in a great position this week. The Atlanta Falcons allowed the third fewest fantasy points to perimeter receivers among home defenses last year. And to me, you know this, I think home and road factors into the matchups. And so unless Pickens breaks like a big play downfield, I do not expect him to have a huge game.
I do think, and you might be surprised, that the Aiyuk analysis is relevant because we all know that the Niners, I think he's an elite wide receiver, but in that offense, they're game plan specific. It's going to be one guy's game this week. It's going to be another guy's game the next week. And so I think the fact that Sauce is there and that's worth pointing out for sure. What about tight ends? Now, clearly there's a handful of them you're never taking off the field, but literally there's a handful of them. There's probably like 5. So of the guys that don't fall into that category, who are we starting this week?
And admittedly, this is like the onesie position where it's really hard to come out and say, well, start this guy, because then some people may be like, well, wait a minute, I have Dalton Kincaid. Well, of course you're going to start Dalton Kincaid. So be smart, start the guys that you drafted to start. And one of them is Kyle Pitts. Now, Kyle Pitts, for the most part, has been a disappointment from a fantasy perspective, but now he's got Kirk Cousins. He told us on Twitter/X, he's going to be there on Sunday. The matchup's good. The Steelers defense allowed the 10th most fantasy points in tight ends last year. So Pitts should put up top 12 numbers. And I want to put Jake Ferguson in this one. The matchup's not good, Lindsay. It's not against Cleveland. The Browns are very good, especially at home. They did give up 2 big games to tight ends in Cleveland last year. It was Mark Andrews and Evan Ingram. But I'm looking more at the target share, right? I mean, we saw Jake Ferguson with a 17% target share last year. That's big. And I think the Cowboys could utilize him if they get inside the goal line, inside the red zone there. So for me, Ferguson is playable as a low tight end one, even though the matchup's not great because it's a thin position. And I do think that Dak Prescott will be looking for Ferguson, especially down in the red zone. So not a great matchup, but I'm still starting him just based on volume.
Sit tight ends, it feels like this is more of a broad, like this season, please reframe your expectations for these guys.
Yeah, brutal. I mean, Cole Kmet, Lindsay and I have been crapping on him like all preseason.
And it's not him.
And no,
it's not him, it's the offense.
Shane Waldron likes to run 2 tight ends. They've got 3 really good wide receivers. And so, really, Cole Kmet's going to be touchdown dependent. If he doesn't score a touchdown, chances are he's not going to be any good. And, oh, by the way, the Titans gave up the 4th fewest fantasy points to tight ends last year. I'm also going to be sitting Dalton Schultz against the Indianapolis Colts. Hey, that rhymes. Last year, Schultz was very difficult to trust. And now you're bringing Stephon Diggs. And now you have Joe Mixon. You've got Tank Dell back. And so how many footballs do they have in Houston? Just like every other team, they only have 1. So again, if Schultz is going to be productive, it's probably going to be getting into the end zone. And oh, by the way, In his career against the Colts, he's averaged 7.3 points per game. So I am sitting Schultz this weekend.
Titans giving up the fewest touchdowns to tight ends because they were so busy giving up all of them to wide receivers.
That's right.
We'll see if they've fixed that secondary a little bit
Yeah.
this week. We are back. Start and sit for week 1 in the can. Do with it what you will.